From the storm-ravaged capital of the Philippines, Manila, I'm Art Bell. And we're going to split what remains of the show into kind of two parts, and both are fascinating. Both are absolutely fascinating. Coming, Dr. Stephen Rorke. Now, he has experience as a professor instructing Masters of Science courses at the university level, has undergraduate, graduate, and doctoral degrees, and uses disciplined inquiry and critical thinking to articulate his message that the role of science should be to investigate the unexplained, not explain the uninvestigated. Dr. Rorke has been a guest on Coast to Coast AM before regarding electronic voice phenomena and the strange case of Spiricom. In addition to having an interest in the paranormal, Dr. Rorke has always had an interest in the esoterica of parapolitics, if you will, or what lies beneath of overt politics and events like the moon landings, or should I rephrase it to the alleged moon landings? This interest led Rorke to collaborate with Ralph Rene, who tragically took his life back in December of 2008. Dr. Rorke is the appointed representative of the research and publications of Ralph Rene, the famous, or if you will, infamous author of NASA Mooned America. That's kind of like the Bible for the people who say we never went to the moon. By the way, I'm not one of those. Dr. Rorke's legitimate connection to Rene can be verified on the only official website of Ralph Rene. That would be www.ralphrene.com. The lunar landing hoax theory is as relevant as ever as a social phenomena and question of scientific legitimacy. Not my words, but the words. So this is going to be fascinating stuff. I think we're going to start it off with Spiricom. So in a moment, Dr. Rorke. It's always difficult to make assumptions about an audience, but this audience I know has had a very great deal of experience with EVP, electronic voice phenomena. We've had an array of guests, actually, who have presented these alleged voices from the grave. Voices recorded on tape recorders are now for the more modern-day practitioners. The digital recorders they use, these voices show up on all of them. And, you know, I've done programs about ghosts, goblins, and other things that go bump in the night for all the time I've been on the air. And the one thing that I've never been able to knock a hole into is EVP, electronic voice phenomena. It appears to me to be real. The people involved in gathering EVP, for the most part, have no motivation, unless it's 15 minutes of fame, to hoax up anything. Moreover, there are people all across America, the world, in fact, doing EVP. Now, that said, the jump to something that's called Spiricom from EVP is a light year jump. I mean, it's gigantic. What happened with Spiricom is one of the most astounding stories you'll ever hear. Several years ago, Dr. Stephen Rorke and I got together on some audio that came from the Spiricom experiments, and it wasn't very good. You know, it was hard to hear, but, it raised the hairs on the back of your neck. It was a long-term experiment, not to just capture the occasional word or even sentence from the other side, but to capture an ongoing, and I don't want to mess this up, I hope I don't get it wrong, but an ongoing conversation with somebody who had gone to the other side, and they did it. Now, that's my description. Dr. Stephen Rorke, welcome back to Coast AM.
Oh, thanks for having me, Art.
You bet. Doctor, I'm turning things around on you because I know you wanted to do or had planned the moon hoax thing first, but Spiricom captured me in a way that nothing else in this field has ever done. And since the time that we got that first audio from Spiricom, what year was it? Do you recall?
I believe it was played 2004, and you had a great deal to do with popularizing it, playing I think, an almost 45-minute uninterrupted segment of the Spiricom promotional tape.
That's right. Would you please, a lot of the audience now will not have heard that. They don't know what Spiricom was. So can you give us the history, please, of Spiricom?
Sure. From the mid-1960s all the way up to the early 1980s, Research on the development of a technological means of communication with the dead was conducted by Metascience Foundation. The two main players we'll be discussing are George W. Meek, who is the president, and William J. O'Neill, a self-described psychic electronics engineer. Now, these two, in conjunction, supposedly developed a device that facilitated, as you described, two-way conversation with the dead. They called it Spiricom, short for Spirit Communication. And the project was officially defined as, and I quote, an electromagnetic etheric systems approach to communications with other levels of human consciousness. So they were focused upon the survivability of personality after death, as you can tell from that lengthy title.
All right, breaking that down into something that at least some of the people will be able to understand, or maybe I'll just give you my take on it. EVP is very tough to get. You let a recorder go, and maybe if you're lucky, you get a word. Maybe if you're really lucky, you get 2 or 3 words or a sentence that appears to come from the other side. Clearly, it seems to come from the other side, but it's always very difficult to get. Now, what they seemed to do with Spiricom was to create this electronic device that, I guess, manufactured some kind of noise, perhaps something like white noise or a variation of it, and that would allow the spirit to modulate. It made it easier for the spirit. The spirit could then modulate a sound that was already there and make it come out loud. I mean, it's a gross simplification, but that's kind of what they did, right?
Well, that's one method. That's more of the route of a method. And I have to state, that is just one take on it. I personally don't subscribe to that, but the research, you're correct, of Meek and O'Neill was predicated upon electronic voice phenomenon. I mean, the whole point of studying something like Spiricom would be because of its importance in the forming of a kind of mythos of electronic voice phenomenon. It literally underrides the subtext of everything that came after it. It is the foundational story on which modern-day contemporary EVP is built. The assumptions of a group of technicians on, the other side in a place called Time Stream, and all of these very elaborate stories built up around this all have their roots in the Spiricom story and the main players born out of Spiricom.
I remember hearing a recording of the voice on the other side they were speaking with. And by the way, who was that mainly on the other side that they were in contact with?
William J. O'Neill reportedly first made contact with a supposedly discarnate being, a deceased NASA scientist named George J. Mueller, Dr. George J. Mueller.
I remember hearing, as they were developing the electronics to make this communication more effective, I remember hearing Dr. Mueller, was it?
Yes.
Yeah. Dr. Mueller actually telling them some electronic component changes they could make to facilitate better communication. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah, certainly. And this is, in part, what made it so compelling to paranormal enthusiasts of its day and even up to today. What I've done is conducted such an extensive study of Spiricom, I've come to a conclusion that it is not what it appears to be, and not to deflate the balloon, but ultimately I think there was some fraud at play. And I don't mean to state that as an obvious type of fraud, like someone was hoaxing quite intentionally. It's much more complicated. The main players...
Let's hear it. If you think there was hoaxing going on, even unintentional, I'd like to know how it happened.
Yes,
and how you reached that conclusion.
From a very extensive investigation dealing with the primary source materials, what I did was tracked back the Metascience Foundation all the way to its modern-day president, who was left in charge of the foundation by George Meek before he passed away. This person, Thomas Pratt, he's in Florida. He possesses all of the old Spiricom technology, all of the Metascience files, reel-to-reel videotapes, audio cassettes, and I've had unfettered access to all of this. And in the process of having access to all of this, I've come across a couple of key details regarding William O'Neill. This is, again, an important part of the story because he was the operator of the Spiricom device, the one who essentially developed it. Okay, so William O'Neill, as it turns out, I'll cut to the quick for you. William O'Neill, I have it documented, he was a schizophrenic, who had a ventriloquist's skill set. He was also in possession of an electrolarynx device, which I have on authority of the equipment manifest that came by way of O'Neill's belongings being packed up and sent to the Metascience Foundation storage.
Wow.
What we'll do, I suppose, is reflect upon some of the sound clips, noting how close they do, in fact, sound to an electrolarynx device, albeit one that's being misused. And it's quite interesting that the two voices never speak at the same time.
Do you have any proof beyond that in fact was what was going on?
No, this is circumstantial because the videotapes from the Metascience archives are all filmed from behind with O'Neill standing at the equipment. We don't see O'Neill's mouth moving. We see hand gestures. We hear sounds. It is compelling to note, though, that on the 1-inch broadcast reels that I have transferred, it's interesting to note that when the sound and visuals are precisely linked up, instead of some of this very generationally distant stuff available on the web, sometimes O'Neill's hand gestures don't match his speech. He's actually making hand gestures when Dr. Mueller's speaking, which is a little bit odd. It only happens once or twice. But again, the issue of technological opacity, in other words, it's like a black box technology. O'Neill didn't let folks know really what was in the Spiricom. He released block diagrams, which you know is very different from schematics.
Oh, sure.
It's a whole other level of detail you'd get with schematics, so no one can reproduce it. O'Neill claimed himself to be almost like a person completing a circuit psychically to make this machine work, thereby making himself indispensable to the process. O'Neill was receiving payment from Meek. This was his only source of income, by the way. And if people look at spiricomstudy.com, they can see all the documentation I'm talking about, up to and including images of O'Neill in a cowboy hat with a puppet from his television days when he did a children's show. So using his ventriloquist skills, the electrolarynx, the equipment, the fact that it's black box type of technology, technologically not transparent, all of this came into play along with the psychology of what I've been studying recently. The most fascinating part of Spiricom, as it turns out, is not really that O'Neill, let's say, hoaxed something. It's really about the motivation to hoax it and how a story like this continues to be perpetuated and how it becomes a foundational mythos. You've had people on the air about what's called a meme, this type of infectious idea.
Let me stop you and ask you, you mentioned motivation to hoax it. Is there an apparent motivation to hoax it on his part that you have found?
Besides the very mundane, obvious reason that if he's receiving monies for results on reel-to-reel and videotape, that he would continue to produce these because it's his only source of income. And there was a one-to-one correlation for how prolifically he was producing these conversations and how much money he was receiving. Beyond that...
That's fine. No, you don't have to go beyond that. Money is always a motivator.
We can go beyond it because the psychology of O'Neill comes into play, where at some level he may not be entirely responsible for what he did. I don't think I'm showing too much sympathy. If the person was mentally ill, I think that has to be taken into account. There are plenty of psychiatric symptoms like O'Neill's. It's led to interesting research on the cognitive nature of delusions.
Was there any diagnosis that you're aware of, actual diagnosis?
Oh, yes. O'Neill died in care at the Torrance State Mental Hospital in Pennsylvania. His diagnosis was that of schizophrenia. I have that on the death certificate indicated. Other conditions besides the one that led to his death were schizophrenia and a couple of other
Boy, this is pretty heavy stuff. You're blowing this wide open. Question. How many times, if at all, were other people present while this communication was going on? Because even though we get camera shots showing the rear, not showing the mouth or the throat or anything else, were there other people present when this occurred?
No. In short, there are tapes in the Metascience files, some of them quite disappointing, where we have Meek visiting O'Neill in his burnt-out husk of a home, sitting for hours on tape just waiting with the 13-tone droning occurring in the background, hoping for some communication, but no.
So when Meek was there, it never happened?
You're correct. And in fact, the Spiricom was duplicated at some level. Sarah Estep received like a desktop version. Alexander McRae was offered to experiment with one, and no one had really gotten the results that O'Neill had. In fact, in 1983, even those results dried up, and Metascience had essentially given up on the Mark IV version and moved on to some other kind of laser induction system instead of using audio.
Dr. Rorke, when did you begin to conclude the things that you have obviously concluded about all this?
Well, it really came together in a kind of synthesis when I just saw this undeniable chain of evidence. Consider it, Art, that we have a schizophrenic with the skills of a ventriloquist who's in possession of an electrolarynx, whose technology...
Oh, no, I'm with you all the way. I mean, was this a year ago, 2 years ago? When?
This was 3 years ago, began to suspect it. 2 years ago, locked it in, published it on SpiricomStudy.com, and appeared on Coast to Coast November of last year, and essentially
blew it all wide open.
Didn't state it so emphatically. Now, more than ever, after some confirmation, I've essentially triangulated the data. I keep finding more and more that seems to confirm exactly what I'm telling you, rather than disconfirm it.
Damn it. I mean, you know, this is really a blow to the whole EVP field. I don't know. I guess for me, it doesn't ruin the whole concept of EVP because I still... Well, let me ask you about that. We don't have a lot of time. We're coming up on a break here, but do you think that EVP is the real McCoy generally, that there really are messages that come across, or do you think the whole thing is a hoax?
No, I don't think the whole thing is a hoax.
All right. Stay right where you are, Dr. Rorke. My goodness. Surprise, surprise. Well, that's the way the world works. From Manila, I'm Art Bell. Dr. Stephen Rorke is blowing Spiricom wide open. Says, hoax. There'll be more. Dr. Rorke, back in a moment. Well, all right. Dr. Stephen Rorke is my guest, blowing Spiricom wide open, and his word, hoax. Doctor, I got a kind of an interesting email from David in Alexandria, Virginia, who says, look, there are many, many ways that an artificial larynx voice box could be used as a very useful component for a project like the one they were in without in any way having it be involving fraud. And that's a fair comment, isn't it?
Well, I think if we were to play a track where Dr.
Wait,
David...
hold on. Before you play a track, just consider this intellectually. An artificial larynx, if you were trying to communicate with the dead and you were getting a response, channeling that response through an artificial larynx would be, I don't know, it seems like an obvious thing you would attempt or experiment with. Is that a fair comment?
That's why Metascience was in possession of it, and ultimately O'Neill came to be in possession of it. However, it needs to be noted that O'Neill did not include this in any way in any of his block drawings. He never conceded to having it. The only reason I know this is because, having unfettered access to the primary source materials, I find old manuals where on page 32 it used to say, the Spiricom manual, which I know you have, the original manual, first edition, stated plainly that Metascience was in possession of this electrolarynx device. The manifest, in other words, the list of all the technologies that were packed up from O'Neill's home when he was instituted, that list also includes this electrolarynx. So there appears to be O'Neill attempting to hide the fact he had it when documents show he did. And, of course, the Spiricom tapes sound exactly like an electrolarynx. So I know that doesn't exactly mean case closed, and I don't mean to make this out to be anticlimactic. I still study the Spiricom case. In fact, I've decided to do so based on the fact that there are so many potential psychological operation models. I'm willing to consider, because of the background of William O'Neill, I'm willing to consider, was this a man who was insane and drawn to this, or was he a man who came to it sane and this drove him mad? Could it be a psychological operation, something on the level of, the Paul Bennewitz incident, as you know, with Richard Doty conspiring to drive this man insane because he had some knowledge about a secret test occurring? Did
O'Neill, prior to his death, ever admit, even when institutionalized, that he had faked any of this?
No, absolutely not. Nope. No. He maintained it was real all the time. There are some interesting hints at this psychological operations angle as far as intelligence ties go. the fingerprints of an individual named Puharich are all over this Spiricom story. In fact, it's all over the story of EVP, Andrea Puharich. I'll give a little background, and I'll do it in a way I think the Coast audience can identify with. Just as the UFO community is heavily influenced by disinformation sent out by well-known authors and lecturers who turned out to be members of an intelligence organization called the Avery, so the belief structure of thousands of New Agers was manipulated and continues to be by individuals claiming to channel information in some different ways. This started with the channeled information emanating from the 9 principles of God, or the 9. And even if we ignore the blatant historical inaccuracies that came out of this group of the 9, this supposed group of celestial beings sending bizarre messages about population reduction, the military and intelligence background of Dr. Andrea Puharich, the founder of the 9 cult, it should be sufficient to question the veracity of any channeled comments that came from this guy. Well, Puharich was actually an individual who visited Konstantin Raudova shortly before he released his book Breakthrough. Here's Puharich visiting the man who ended up popularizing at the world level what we consider to be EVP, the Latvian psychologist with literally hundreds of thousands of EVP examples. Puharich spent a day with him, whereas the Latvian psychologist was initially skeptical of his own findings. After spending some time with Puharich, like almost everyone who does spend some time with Puharich, they end up becoming converted to his exact views. This is the case with Uri Geller and many others. Puharich has got his fingerprints on the trip that Meek took to visit Arrigo, the rusty knife surgeon in Brazil. And this is where some of the NASA military intelligence ties come in. And this is why I continue to study it, because I'm not entirely certain it's as simple as O'Neill doing this all on his own, because the motivations are kind of thin, and there is the chicken or the egg question, isn't there? Was he driven insane, or was he insane and drawn to it?
That's a big one, all right. I can imagine that actually being in communication with the dead at any level could tip somebody leaning in that direction all the way over very easily, couldn't it?
Yeah, I would think so. Even if someone was, of course, creating a situation where you would think that in of itself could really strain the sanity of anyone.
And there's one other possibility, Dr. Rorke, and that would be that at some level there was, some reality to what happened with this whole case, and then perhaps at some later date or midway through or a quarter way through, he decided to begin enhancing the material for, if you will, the money motivation or whatever motivation he had. So it could be a mixture. Some of it could have been real, and then he could have decided, hey, what a nice income. Let's really do it up here. So who knows?
Yes, all possibilities. And in fact, that is exactly why I continue to find it interesting, is this notion of aberrant organizational psychology, where we would look at this and say, no ordinary person has anything to gain by sharing these bizarre experiences, right? I mean, it's counterintuitive to think a person claiming to have these experiences would want to do so. This is the same notion behind, let's say, again, to make a comparison the Coast audience can understand, like, why would someone who has an alien abduction come out and talk about this? It's so counterintuitive. It's almost evidence that it happened, right? Because no one would really talk about this unless it did. Well, the inverse is, in fact, true regarding the sharing of paranormal experiences in small groups with a population of paranormal enthusiasts. And the notion that people have nothing to gain is really belied by 2 empirical observations. 1, the compulsion of the people to constantly share it, and 2, the confabulation of the story that you just talked about, the one-upsmanship, sometimes with themselves, and sometimes, again, in aberrant group psychology, where they're one-upping each other with more fantastic tales. And we saw this in the UFO movement. Oh,
yeah. Not only disinformation in ufology, but consistent hoaxes. I mean, hoax after hoax after hoax after hoax. It gets very difficult to delineate between them. And it just ruins ufology. That's not even to mention the infighting that goes on, not as a result necessarily of disinformation, just people's egos getting involved. Not as much of that in EVP, but
Well, you'd be surprised.
No, I wouldn't.
Well, you probably wouldn't be. But there was a power grab at the end of Meek's life for who was going to take over control of the Metascience Foundation because of this coveted position of president of the organization that was responsible for the Spiricom. Again, Spiricom, you cannot underestimate the role it played as the foundational ethos of the entire technological paranormal mediumship movement. This Frank Bach, the telephone to the dead Chris Moon is running around charging people by the hour for. All of these things are predicated upon the Spiricom. Well, I mean, you could go further back, I guess, if you look at the birth of ITC with that Scientific American article regarding Edison's attempt to communicate with the dead. But really, it's anchored more in the contemporary story of Spiricom.
All right, let's go ahead, and I know you've got a couple of clips, and, they'll, I think, play them at the network for us. So if you would tell them what you would like, what are we going to be playing?
For the sake of the audience, because if they heard anything online that wasn't at Spiricom's study, they've heard audio that was degraded, thrice removed, and generationally distant, and it's really grating and difficult to listen to as it is. But the newly discovered Spiricom audio is a level of clarity I know you'll be excited about, and I'd be pleased to share the entirety of the new audio with you and perhaps see what you find in it. But track 3 is about 50 seconds long, and it shows the quality of the newly discovered Spiricom audio from the Metascience archives.
Well, I know some of the audience is going to recall the night that I played that 40 minutes, which was pretty hard to listen to, but I couldn't avoid it. It was so fascinating. So track 3, you say, back at the network, go ahead and cue up, and let's play track 3.
No, I just turned the TV camera on, sir. What did you say, William? I said I just turned the TV camera on. Oh, very well. You never know, Doctor. Yes, I understand, William. All right, now, very well. Now let's get on with this. And what I suggest, William, is that we disregard this audio project. Audio project? Yes, in your words. Spiricom, and get on with the television aspects. Oh, I see. Yeah, I see. How much better it would be not only to be able to speak, but to visualize the subject who we're speaking to. You understand, William? Yeah, I understand. Just a minute, sir. Just a minute.
God.
Much clearer, isn't it?
If I didn't hear everything that much clearer, yes. If I had not heard everything that you just said in the first part of the hour here, the hair would be standing up on the back of my neck like it did the first time I heard it without any clarity like we just heard. That was incredible. Now, again, you're telling us that never was there an overlap in the speech.
That's correct. In fact, there are moments when O'Neill quite dramatically points out, we were talking at the same time, but upon critical analysis, it's assailable at the evidential level. If you parse it through a simple program like Audacity, if someone spends the time, there is no actual overlap. What there is an occasional bleed that occurs between what I theorize to be O'Neill's voice and his oral cavity in proximity to the grinding electrolarynx you clearly hear when the audio is not generationally distant. That was not just the 13 tones in the far distance. What you heard was primarily the electrolarynx buzzing away. And this is a problem, of course, for the Spiricom story, because if it's the case that the clearer the audio gets, the more it sounds like an electrolarynx, that's kind of a problem for the adherents, the paranormal enthusiasts, who no doubt will continue to write maddening emails. And the hate mail I got after the November show was incredible. The loonies come out of the woodwork. But I can't come on and misrepresent it to appease people. This is my conclusion. Now, I'm not attempting to make anyone's mind up for them, but I do have the clearest audio by way of the actual archives.
No, look, you have no idea how I appreciate what you are doing now. And it kind of takes guts in a different sort of way to come back and say, look, I've been looking at this for years now, and here's what's wrong with it. I think there's a problem. That takes guts, and I appreciate it. I don't buy into everything automatically, but, EVP, Dr. Rorke, was one of the things that I bought into, and frankly, I still buy into it. I've got a couple up in Oregon with no motivation whatsoever to be faking what they're doing. None whatsoever. Very nice people, and I don't believe for 1 second they're faking it. So there's something real on those tapes. There is something apparently to EVP. I can understand the motivation or the alleged motivation of somebody like O'Neill to possibly, I don't know, enhance it, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Well, I completely agree. This is why investigating the psychological operations angle behind Spiricom is important. Think about it. If Spiricom is held out as the best evidence standard, EVP on steroids, this isn't just little truncated bits. This is real-time communication. It is the ultimate extension of EVP experimentation. If that's held out there as the best evidence, and then it's undermined so easily, so assailable at the evidential level, maybe someone had this in mind. If there is something to EVP, someone who wanted to control the fact that people did or did not believe in EVP. In one of the psychological operations models, I point specifically at a large church organization. Take, for example, the involvement of, and I'm not pointing fingers, this is just one of the models to be clear. Take, for example, the Catholic Church, their involvement in early EVP. In the book called The Voices from the Tapes by Peter Bender, a goodly half the book is dedicated to his involvement with Vatican contacts, their great interest in it, their permissibility of it, in stark contrast to saying Ouija boards, no good, but mediumship of the tape recorder was good. Now, that doesn't continue to be the Catholic Church's message, but it could be an instance where the fox lures the chickens into feeling comfortable enough to have the story turn their way. And I can assure you, I wasn't fed anything, but I can also assure you that for a long time I was disinformed and led down a rabbit hole, Art. I spent about a year investigating what I thought was a tie between an entirely separate George Mueller. You know, there was a real NASA Mueller, and there was also this other Mueller who did in fact exist, who worked at Orange Coast Community College and also had some space program and rocketry ties. Very bizarre. These two guys with the same name having resume overlaps, and I spent the longest time establishing the case that these people were one and the same and that he might have been still alive up until 2001. That turned out to be totally untrue, but there's no way I could have come up with so many ties that are presented on SpiricomStudy.com to establish that without, I think, someone going out of the way to make it appear this way. In other words, like a rabbit hole to send someone down, the classic muddying of the waters.
Doctor, our hour is evaporating. Is there any evidence the tapes were tampered with in any way?
No, as you see, when they get more and more clear, it's really evident what's happening on the tapes. You know, to speak to EVP, if we consider EVP kind of collectively to describe anomalously recorded sounds approximating vocal utterances as perceived by the listener, I think there's an expansive data set that needs to be looked at.
Hold it right there. We're at the end of the hour. We'll come back and do a little more of this and then move on to the moon, if you will. My guest is Dr. Stephen Rorke. We're talking about Spiricom, and he's blowing the whole thing wide open. I'm Art Bell.